40K's last balance update has certainly helped out some armies and done some good things for others, but let's talk through a few major criticisms, maybe some of the fails of the balanced data slate, where Games Workshop hasn't taken some easy wins for some factions. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about the balance update once more. In this video I thought I'd talk through a fair share of criticisms that some people have had for Games Workshop's last update. As we've talked about in a few videos already, over the past day or so, 40K's last balance thing changed a whole bunch of points. It was certainly nowhere near as cataclysmic as a few of the major shifts that they've had in the past, but still has made some meaningful points changes to a bunch of factions, some of them more nudges, some of them really quite major shifts, and it will shake up the game a good amount from where it was before. Broadly speaking, at least in terms of army versus army balance, the game of Warhammer 40K isn't really in the worst place compared with where it's been often in the past. Prior to the data slate, the worst factions in the game had a win rate of around 42%, the best around about 57%. That is better than it's been for the most part of Warhammer 40K's history, particularly if you compare it towards the slight train wreck that was the start of 10th, where you had more like 30% with the lowest faction and 70% with the highest. We are in a position where the vast majority of armies can compete against the vast majority of others with a good player and a strong list. There's obviously still loads of room for improvement, but still best to acknowledge that, so as not to encourage Games Workshop to go back to the stupidity that we've had in the past. For the actual balance change this time round, broadly speaking, I do think that it still did more good than harm. Most factions that were towards the top of the game either got some small nerfs or side grades. Most factions that tended to be struggling the most broadly got some help, some to a greater or lesser extent, which we will talk about, and plenty of things in the middle got some okay internal balance type changes, some of the best stuff maybe going up a tiny bit, some of the worst stuff going down a little, though they didn't touch every faction. For this video I wanted to talk about the main criticisms of the balanced data slate that I've seen about online and offer my own thoughts on them. It did feel like there were just a few really obvious things that I'm just surprised that they didn't do something about this time round. Some things they absolutely could have changed with points, and maybe a few limitations of the balance update given that it was points only. There's just a few things that really needed rules fixes as opposed to points changes. Getting into it though, I feel like maybe one of the really easy wins they could have had was a little bit more help for the Titanic Chaos Knights. I feel like tournament data is pretty conclusive on this one. While the Titanic Knights aren't as bad as they used to be, they had points cuts last time round. You can still clearly see from armies of Chaos Knights that have been doing well at top tournaments, basically every single tournament list has been almost entirely War Dogs, mainly the Brigands and the Carnivores. Then the other common factor has been Demons and Nurglings, maybe a bunch of Nurglings plus some Beasts of Nurgle or things like that if you want a few other sturdy objective grabbers. A few lists daring to add in a Cerastus Knight Lancer, that seems to be the only big knight that sees tournament play of any real description. For lists that actually place well in big events, there's almost zero use of any Titanic Knight from the Codex, none of the Tyrant classes, and none of the Abhorrent classes, and it just clearly feels like an army where you can easily tell that they're underpowered versus the War Dogs, even if the faction's overall external balance isn't horrible. They've got around about a 49% win rate, even if they tend to not be the best army at topping big events, given that they have a bit of a skill ceiling perhaps. It just feels like this could have been a really easy place to make some simple points changes. It wouldn't even have to be anything, maybe just another nudge towards the Titanic Knights, dropping another 10 or 20 points or so. That would even up the balance a little bit more, even if it doesn't get them there yet. It just seems that with every points change for these guys, they should be further evening the balance between the Titanics and the War Dogs until the Titanic Knights actually see play. They seem to have reached that point for the Imperial Knights, where there's multiple big Titanic Knights that do get use, even if Canis Rex is a bit more dominant compared with some of the rest. It really does seem that there can't be any reason that the Chaos Knights can't be the same for that, and I feel like most Chaos Knight players don't usually get into it for War Dog spam. They want to be putting their Abominants, Desecrators and Rampagers on the table and feeling good about it. Overall just feels like an army change that could have done really quite well with the points changes, but instead just got completely ignored. Next up, points change wise, Deathwatch getting nothing, it just feels really quite lazy. They are a very niche faction in Warhammer 40k, I believe the single least played right now, and Games Workshop do seem to have a habit of sort of forgetting they exist every so often. For some reason, Games Workshop sort of conspicuously didn't decide to publish any sort of table of win rates alongside Warhammer 40k at the moment. Not really sure of their reasoning for that, maybe trying to stave off criticism perhaps. But from other sources it looks like they are probably about the lowest ranked faction in the game, around about 42% wins and a spectacularly low player rate, almost no one choosing to run them in competitive at all. Given that kind of stats and performance, it really does stick out. They got absolutely no update. In general, their logic seems to be that anything that's 45% wins or less usually gets some boosts, and often kind of major ones, but that's just not the case this time round. The other armies that were on the low end of the spectrum, like Standard Space Marines, Chaos Space Marines, Admech, World Eaters, and Dark Angels, all got improvements, but these guys did not for some reason, despite having win rates lower than most of those. As I mentioned in previous videos, I feel like the vast majority of their index is just overcosted for what it does. The Terminators didn't even go down in cost alongside the other options, and the Primaris kill teams all feel like they've just paid far too much for what they do since the edition launched. There have been some rumours going around that there might be some chance they might get reinterpreted or rolled into an Agents of the Imperium type book. I'm not really too sure what to make of them, there's certainly speculation at the moment, but if so, that probably would go hand in hand with them being a bit more neglected at this balance pass, though even with other armies that are getting major updates so far, like the Chaos Space Marines that have their codex out soon, they still got major changes. I did notice that in the Warhammer community article, they weren't called out even as one of the armies that got little or no changes. They mentioned Demons, Chaos Knights, Imperial Knights, and Death Guard. I don't know if they might have been omitted from that because the core Codex Space Marine units got changes, but that isn't exactly very helpful if you want to run a Deathwatch kill team focused force. In any case, not the best news for the Imperium Xenos Hunters. Feels like they're basically going to just remain no stronger than standard Codex Space Marines, basically having the same strong options as they have and not really adding much strength of their own. Next up, I know they have said that some sort of rules update is going to be coming for the Admech in the next data slate, but in the meantime, I can't help but think that it's a bit funny that Games Workshop really have just done the thing that most Admech players were saying that they might do, and as a stopgap patch have just made them even more Horde. Since 10th edition came out, people have generally felt that Admech units just haven't been particularly punchy, and just ridiculously expensive to collect, with some of the lowest points per dollar around, meaning that any given army will cost you a load of real world money. And then if anything, the Codex really doubled down on that, the best builds being things like Skitarii Hunter Cohort for loads of annoying nuisance move blocking, maybe backed up by a few Cataphron breaches. And then at the balance pass that followed that, Admech got no changes whatsoever, much to the annoyance of all the people that really wanted the faction fixed in some form or another. That meant that again they're one of the least competitively played armies, kind of similar to the level of Genestealer cults and not much in front of Deathwatch. They've often had talking points, they're just not an enormously fun faction to play, nor a strong one either, with win rates around about 44% or so. I'm not saying it's literally all doom and gloom, I've certainly had some interesting and close casual games playing against Admech, but in general I think that people had set some pretty high hopes on this balance update to try and sort them out a bit, and Games Workshop's answer this time round has been we're going to do yet more points cuts to the faction, making the units that have sort of reasonable points per dollar ratios get worse, and then check back on us in another 3 months or so where we'll do some sort of rules update, which hopefully they might finally get right for the faction. Fingers crossed then perhaps give them some similar sort of love to what Drukhari got, that really turned them around from being a depressing faction to collect and play, to one that got really quite interesting and far more dangerous. In the meantime though, piling on yet more points cuts to the Cog Boys is sort of getting to pretty much meme levels now. Rostalkers are down to 60 points for the fighting elite of the army. The Castellan robots and Core both dropped, but even then probably getting to the point where they're just kind of okay as opposed to stand out great. And Rangers and the heavy gun tanks went down as well, as did the Cataphron destroyers. Admittedly, I feel like it's not the worst shot in the arm for actual power boost in tournaments, and it is quite nice to see a few of the other damage dealers just get all around more efficient, so players might have a little bit more reason to move away from Cataphron breachers to try out other things. Maybe not the worst stopgap patch if they really couldn't do rules changes this time due to a balanced data slate, but still feels like a bit of a fail given that this is the exact thing that Admech players were generally saying they didn't want. They didn't want their units to get cheaper, they want them to get more dangerous or scary. The time frame for this as well is maybe a little bit disappointing too. The Codex came out in December, the next balance pass was at the end of January where they got nothing. This one's now in April where they got the further points decreases and sort of doubled down on the theme of the Codex, and that should mean that the next balance pass should be late July sort of time. Another 3 months or so to go there. I think it just would have been a lot more feels good if they'd done the points changes like this at the last data slate and then got the rules in order for this one. Given what they've done though, I'm absolutely not surprised that Games Workshop decided to very clearly communicate that they are making rules changes to the faction well ahead of time. I think if they'd just dropped off those points costs and said nothing about it, the binary screeching of the internet would have been even louder. Otherwise, on the points changes, they do feel like there were lots of units that got some good attention, but lots of things were also passed over. It is maybe just a little bit disappointing when you see the same units that basically never get taken, just get passed over time and time again for points updates, when some of them just feel really obvious choices that stick out as bad for their factions, despite being kind of key units with some cool models. This is massively far from any sort of exhaustive list, though I'm sure there's plenty of people down in the comments that will like to mention their unit that wasn't mentioned here. But just to pick out just a few examples from a few factions, I think Reavers for Space Marines, again, are kind of meme levels that they'll never be good. It's really weird to see them at 85 when the jump intercessors drop down to 80. The Blightlord Terminators for the Death Guard just haven't had much luck this edition. They might be the cheapest Terminators that you can field right now, but they still get no play in games thanks to Death Shroud just being better. I guess maybe Typhus might be breathing a sigh of relief to get away with still being 80 points though. He's still pretty epic for the Death Guard, so not all bad for them there, I guess. For the Imperial Knights, the Knight Valiant just feels badly balanced versus the rest. I feel like they didn't really notice when it lost its Overwatch that was one of the main reasons to take it. It just feels like far below the other Titanic Knights for competitive lists currently. Drukhari Helions just feel kind of notable as maybe one of the single poorly balanced units for Drukhari. Almost the entire rest of the index feels quite playable now, which is genuinely quite impressive. They're just not really strong either in Sky Splinter or Real Space Raid and need a drop to rival Reavers and things for that sort of role, I reckon. The Astra Militarum Valkyrie, I think I'd like to politely petition to ask Games Workshop to exclude that from the flyers must always be bad sort of policy they have going on now. I feel like the flyers that cause problems tend to be the big damage dealer ones, where they can potentially just swoop on the board turn 2 and delete large chunks of the enemy army. That's never going to be an issue with the Valkyrie. It's basically a fun high investment transport to deliver units to the front lines early on. Doesn't have that much damage output that can be kind of fun with Scions jumping out and throwing melter weapons about. Plus it's just kind of iconic if you do want to make a themed Scion list to have a bunch of air cavalry there alongside some Taurox Primes perhaps. At the moment it's just kind of hilariously overcosted though at around 200 points. Otherwise the Genestealer Cult Majors being 50 points probably needs a datasheet rewrite more so than a points update I guess, but easily the worst character for the Genestealer Cults. And for the Chaos Space Marines, maybe the Lord Discordant on Hellstalker is worth a mention. I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with the datasheet. For some reason it's just been massively costly since 10th edition came out, all the way up at like 200 points. Just no real reason to take one versus all the other datasheets that you could be having instead. I feel like just a few of these maybe seem like fairly obvious ones that could have gone down a bit, though admittedly they did hit a fair few other underpowered picks. Things like the Tactical Marines getting a bit of love was nice, Sanguinary Guard finally dropping down a bit, and Eldar Howling Banshees getting a points cut I thought were all fun moves. Overall, I feel like there maybe aren't quite as many examples of just rampant underpowered units throughout every single army, at least compared with 40k's past, even if there's plenty of things that you can still point to. Otherwise, just for a few thoughts on army balance things, I thought I'd talk through a couple of factions here. I must admit I was kind of surprised to see Thousand Sons do so weirdly well out of this. They're definitely an army that's maybe a bit limited in builds recently, and it certainly takes skill to play, playing Magnus properly, and knowing exactly which Kabbalistic rituals are going to best twist the fate of the game into your favour. But they have been doing really quite well on the tournament scene recently. Win rates are around about 55% and plenty of event wins. By those measures, they do feel like they were one of the strongest factions of Warhammer 40k, even if there's plenty of rivals. Given those stats, I was just kind of surprised that they got quite so many points cuts. Scarab Occult Terminators dropping down from 215 to 200 really puts them back on the map where they've been sort of neglected before, and getting cheaper screening chaff in Cultist doesn't hurt, and maybe some lists will find a bit of use for some of the supporting demon engines and things, though admittedly they did tend to be kind of rarely played. They did get a little bit to balance them out with 2 10-point increases to some commonly taken enhancements, so I guess it's not all one way. I still do wonder though if this might be the fated time for Thousand Sons to be one of the strongest factions in Warhammer 40k. Both the arguable top factions from the last meta in Necrons and Custodes took some really big hits. Plenty of much more serious points increases for Necrons, and Custodes got their new codex, which wasn't the best news for them. As a result, it does mean that the Thousand Sons look like they're in perhaps an unusually good place right now. Their core army has only taken a very slight knock in those enhancement increases, and if you wanted to go beyond that a bit, there's a few more credible support options that you could use now. Otherwise, I must admit that the Imperial Guard changes felt pretty weird. Guard have been in a slightly strange place since the last balanced data slate, and overall faction win rates are around about 46% or so. the majority of players finding them to be one of the slightly weaker factions of Warhammer 40k, but having one really quite convergent strong build that was occasionally topping tournaments, basically a mix of Basilisks, Manticores, Borgrins and Kazakin, most of which tended to be absolutely omnipresent, and many of them spammed quite heavily, and then they all got hit with fairly significant points increases, the Manticores going up to 190, the Basilisks to 150, Borgrins to 90 per 3 of them, and Kazakin taking perhaps the single most painful points increase all the way up from 100 to 120. I really think that they went too far with those guys. I just maybe felt when you take that all together, it's perhaps a little excessive for a faction that is basically on the lower end of the 40k power spectrum for the average player, even if a few top tournament players might have been doing well. Maybe it feels like one of the times when the top end of the competitive meta might be determining the changes for the wider faction. The artillery changes are probably mainly just falling in Games Workshop's policy of nerf indirect fire gradually until it's really niche for competitive play. Maybe a shame for the Guard though, given that artillery is actually one of their major themes. It definitely wasn't all one way though. They did get their more standard Lehman Russ variants to go down 10 points, which genuinely has some of them looking a lot more interesting. Scions and their command squads can actually put out some pretty serious damage out of Deep Strike, and Rough Riders, Hellhounds and Hydras went down a bit too. My guess is their tournament win rates probably won't drop that much from this, given that they're quite a deep codex with a whole load of different interesting options. But given that the one build that was winning tournaments got hammered quite so hard from multiple different angles, I certainly wouldn't be too surprised if we don't see as many top event placings for them, while their win rate remains pretty mediocre. Yes, we'll see though. I certainly think it was pretty reasonable to try and make tanks a bit more the focus of the mainline damage dealer for the army, maybe with the artillery in a more supporting role. Otherwise, for balance changes, broadly I think they did quite well with the Necron ones. Points increases on a whole bunch of units, but not so much they've absolutely tanked Necrons as a faction. I say that the vast majority of units that got nerfed are still usable, and they were coming from being the single strongest faction in the game by a fairly clear margin. I'm maybe a bit suspicious as to whether or not they hit the Catan hard enough though. I absolutely have nothing against them being strong, but I feel like they're probably at the point where they're still going to oppress other options in the Necron army, particularly given a few of their other options also went up in points. For at least the majority of competitive Necron lists, they all started with the Void Dragon and Nightbringer. Some chose to leave them out, but they tended to be in the minority. And some lists went absolutely whole hog, spamming a bunch of Transcendent Catans alongside that as well, or even just one or two. Prior to the updates, they were considered to be pretty much the most undercosted models in all of Warhammer 40k, just for the points having too much damage and defense for certain armies to handle, particularly maybe in more casual games where players aren't playing quite as cleverly with just playing the mission and might be focusing a bit more on a damage game. The Nightbringer did go up the most, from 255 to 295, which seems reasonable enough. That's a fairly big increase at 15%, and that seems kind of reasonable. The Void Dragon, which also seemed to be pretty much equally auto-include though, only got a small increase, jumping from 270 to 290, while the Transcendent kind of got a pretty minimal change, only jumping from 275 to 285. Not really a points change that I think is really going to consider how much it's played. The Deceiver tended to be the one that wasn't played in competitive anywhere near as much, though given it got no changes whatsoever at 265, that's still looking interesting. It's got pretty good big hitting melee against elite infantry with all that damage 3. And it's arguably the single hardest Catan to take down as well, with inbuilt stealth, just in case you needed one more barrier to damage. The redeploy thing isn't nothing either, occasionally that can be helpful. I think it is sensible that the Catan did go up a bit, and maybe it is best just to gradually nerf them as opposed to go all out and make them outright bad. But I can't help but think at these points cost they're probably still going to be kind of oppressive to other options in the Necron army. You might still just take the Void Dragon and Nightbringer and just wind up with slightly fewer Necron units in the rest of the army. I know the whole meme 6 Catan list isn't necessarily at the top of the competitive meta or anything like that, but seeing as you can still achieve 6 Catan on the board for less than 1800 points and have a few minimal units for scoring objectives and things, that still seems kind of hilariously problematic for some enemy armies to deal with. They might struggle to kill even one of those star gods, let alone an army full of 6 of them. In any case, I do suspect that Necrons will have taken a good hit to their power level, probably a bit more in line with the other top factions as opposed to well above them, which I think is good. Maybe it might have been nice just to see a little bit more internal balance though. I feel like Warriors dropping down a point to 9 points might not have been the worst to make them a bit more exciting again. Would have been good to have them competing with Immortals just a little bit better. Otherwise, for a few more minor criticisms and thoughts, Custodes I think really could have done with some sort of devastating wound protection coming back. At the moment, they feel like they're going to be reverting to how they were prior to the January balance data slate. A defensive stat line is just not as easy to rely on when a fair few armies can kind of easily bypass them. I'd guess they might get something like that back in the next balance data slate, but that's 3 months away. Given the rules nerfs in the codex, I wouldn't be too surprised if they're heading towards the bottom end of the 40k meta now, even if they came from their position as one of the strongest factions in the game. Otherwise, Codex Space Marines and Tyranids both look like they're still going to be towards the bottom end of the meta, despite getting a few buffs. They feel like the sort of boost that help out the faction a bit peripherally, but aren't really going to revolutionise them. More the sort of thing that makes bad units sort of okay, as opposed to okay units actually ones that are good and might appear in competitive lists. There are maybe a few exceptions. Jump Intercessors at 80 points are genuinely looking very nice. The Space Marine Vindicator at 175 I'm sure will appear in Ironstorm Spearhead. And of all things, the Tyranid Psychophage dropping by a big 30 points all the way down to 95 might actually be worth it for its Feel No Pain type aura, and just one annoying other monster that the enemy is going to have to kill. It is at least somewhat durable with its Feel No Pain. Finally, I thought I'd mention the Blood Angels as well. They'd been doing a bit more interestingly, and I felt like they were actually not doing too bad balance-wise. Win rates are around about 47% since Games Workshop buffed the Sons of Sanguinius. I really was kind of surprised though when they looked at the Death Company and Lamarties and decided that they needed to go up in points cost, even if they did choose to drop the points a bit on Sanguinary Guard, as Blood Angels players have been hoping that they might do for a fair while. I just don't think that the Death Company and Lamarties were overpowered for their points cost. They're very destructive, but also a big investment unit, and for the big points investment, certainly not all that hard to kill if you could get the first strike on them, even with Feel No Pain and -1 damage. Honestly, I felt like Blood Angels were in a kind of alright place. I think they could have left those units absolutely as they were, and just done the points decreases for Sanguinary Guard and maybe Mephiston and some of the others. That would probably just be bringing more things up to the point of being usable, as opposed to actually making them overpowered or anything like that. I just don't think there was much danger of that with the Blood Angels. I suppose it's not all absolutely bad for them. The Death Company Intercessors look a bit better, and so do the Jump Assault Intercessors from the core codex. Not really sure that their best units needed to go up in cost to pay for that though. In any case, let me know your thoughts. I'd be interested to hear what you make of the balanced data slate. What do you think the Games Workshop did well, and what do you think they did badly? Look forward to hearing your feedback down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.